If you're like me and think about Old English all the time, then in the past few weeks of Odyssey excitement, perhaps the question occurred to you, did the early medieval English know who Odysseus was? The answer is yes, kind of. They wouldn't have known him as Odysseus. His name in Old English was Aulixes, which we'll discuss momentarily. But the average well-educated 9th century English monk would probably have been able to tell you the general story of the Odyssey, who the main characters were, and maybe even narrate some of the more iconic moments. They would also probably make a number of mistakes with names, places, and plot elements, which would betray the fact that they hadn't actually read the poem. How do we know this? Well, what I just described is actually exactly what we get in Odysseus's only recorded mention in Old English. He is the subject of a poem in King Ælfred's translation of the Consolation of Philosophy, and today I'd like to read this poem with you, discussing what it tells us about knowledge of the Odyssey in early medieval England. Stay tuned. Let's go back to the 9th century in Wessex, where King Alfred the Great is attempting to establish a new golden age of education in England. One of the ways he's doing this is by commissioning translations, some of which we think were actually translated right in front of him with his input, of important Latin works. These include Augustine's Soliloquies, Orosius's History, Gregory's Pastoral Care, and Boethius's Consolation of Philosophy, one of the most popular and influential works in medieval Europe. Now, while we call these translations, they are really more like adaptations, and we're told in the preface to the Old English Boethius that the book was translated sometimes word by worde, word for word, and sometimes ondit by ondite, meaning for meaning. The translators were very comfortable changing and even adding entire sections in order to facilitate the better understanding of the reader, such as in the Old English Orosius, when the original description of the Roman world in the beginning is enlarged to include the tribes and peoples of the North Sea and the Baltic, places with which the early medieval English would have been familiar. I say all this because the plot of the Odyssey, specifically the episode with Circe, is referenced in the original Latin of the Consolation of Philosophy, but Boethius assumed the reader would know the story so well he didn't even bother to mention Odysseus, instead calling him Neritius Dux, the lord of the mountain of Neriton on the island of Ithaca. So our first clue as to the learning of the 9th century English is that the Old English translator not only names Odysseus in the new version, he adds 60 lines, doubling the size of the poem, in order to explain who Odysseus was, why he was at sea, who Circe and Apollo were, and why Odysseus was on Circe's island. Clearly there was some understanding that the reader just might not have known these things. But the Odyssey was so influential and popular, why didn't they read it? Well, it's in Greek, and the number of people on the island of Britain after the Viking raid at Lindisfarne in 793 who could read Greek was probably zero, or close to zero, for at least 100 years, if not more than that. We don't have any evidence that there was ever even a manuscript of the Odyssey in England during this period, and Odysseus' single mention in the entire corpus of Old English, especially the fact that he's left out of the story of Troy in the Orosius translation, suggests that they really didn't know or care about him that much, and it's probably safe to assume that their only source for the Odyssey was conversation with foreign scholars and the references made in the Aeneid, which was one of the most widely read and popular works in England at the time. But enough exposition, let's read what they did have to say about him. The context of the poem is that Boethius's imaginary advisor, named Mode in the Old English, is making the point that people who are consumed by vice become more animal than human. Mode then sings a poem about Circe turning Odysseus's men into animals to give an example of an instance in which the mind of a man is in the body of an animal as opposed to when someone is consumed by vice and the mind of an animal is in the body of a human. This Old English poem isn't very long, but I'll still read it piecemeal in order to discuss each section individually. Here's the beginning. Each they me ade aldemon lasum spellum rechan sprache elice evne thisse ilkan de wit sprecach. Hit je salde you on sumetire that Aulixes under have de tham casere cineri gutois, he was thracia theuda aldor on retie riches hyrde. Was his fradrichnes focus noma Agamemnon se alles world creca riches. Cuth was vide that on tire Troia win warth under vognum, for we is herd creca drichten komstere sechan, Aulixes mid an hund schipper lad de over lagustram, sat longe there, teen winter full, thas eu tid je lomp that he that riche je racht havdon,
Deore cepte drichten crega Troia borg tilum isidum.
So the poet promises a story relating to the discussion being had, that is, on the internal corruption of vice, and right away mentions Odysseus. Or should I say Aulixes, which seems to be the accepted form of his name in Old English, or at least in the court of King Ælfred. The first half of why they called him that is easy to explain. His name in Latin was Aulixes, that's the name by which Virgil calls him, and consequently that's the name that he gets in many Western colloquial traditions. Perhaps the premier example of this is the adaptation of the Odyssey made in English literature, Ulysses, by James Joyce. But that doesn't explain why the Old English called him Aulixes, and to date I've never seen anyone try to explain why they added an A to the beginning of his name. While discussing this with my colleagues, my friend Roman Beck made the point that Italians pretty early on began confusing au and u, and so it's conceivable that a hardworking but misguided scribe saw the name Ulixes in a Latin manuscript, thought that it was a mistake for Aulixes, corrected it, and then sent it to England, and that's the form that they had. That kind of thing happens a lot in scribal transmission, so it's a very plausible explanation. It does leave a few question marks, but it's the best one I've heard. If you've got a better idea, definitely let me know in the comments. We are told that this Aulixes guy is the king of Thrace and a place called Rhaetiae. Thrace seems to be a mistake for Ithaca, and actually an earlier version names Ithaca, so this seems to be one person's mistake, not everyone's. Rhaetiae seems to be a reference to the mountain of Neraton mentioned by Boethius in the original Latin, so maybe the early medieval English thought that it was another island or something. Rhaetia is the name for Switzerland, but I doubt that they thought Odysseus was the king of just Thrace and Switzerland. This seems to be just a spelling mistake. We're told that Agamemnon is the king of all the Greeks and that Odysseus took 100 ships to Troy in his support. This also seems to be a slight confusion. Homer at least tells us that Agamemnon had 100 ships, Odysseus only had 12. The poet continues to briefly describe the Trojan War, and does correctly tell us that it lasted 10 years. What happened next?
Tha Aulixes lave havde, Thracia kynning, that he thonon moste, he leit him behindan hyrnde cheulas, nigon und hund nigonti, nanine thonon merehengeste ma thonne anne ferde on fivelstram, fami bordum thrirethre cheul, that bith that maste craigish rashipa. Tha werth child weder, sterk storma je laak, stunde seo brune, uth with odre, ut feora draf on wendelsau we in drashola, up on that eland, thar Apollinus dochter wunude, dairimus worn.
So now we are told of Odysseus' departure from Troy. No mention of the Trojan horse is interesting, given that Virgil tells us all about it in the second book of the Aeneid. But Virgil doesn't explicitly say that it was Odysseus' idea, he just attributes it to the ductores, the leaders of the Greeks. So I wouldn't be surprised if some English monks and scholars genuinely didn't know that Odysseus and the horse were associated. Instead, this Old English poem tells us that the hero left 99 of his ships at Troy, taking only one trireme with him on the way home. Then bad weather comes and strands Odysseus on Circe's island. Circe is named here as the daughter of Apollo, which is close enough to her actual father, Helios.
Vase Apollinus atheles kynnes, Jobes avra, se was you king. Se licete lutlum miclum gumina welcome, that he god ware, hichst on hagost. Swa se hlavord tha that dizzy folk on ye dwellon that day, of that him ye leave de leura unrim, for tham he was mid richte riche hirde, heura kinnekinnes. Cuth is wide that on tha tide theude eiwelch have don heura hlavord forth on a hichstan god, on wirdo don swa wuldres kynning, if he to tham riche was on richte boren. Was das Jobes fader god axwa he, Saturnus thon a sundbuende heton helta barn, have don tha meitha alkne after odrum for ekne god.
Here we get less of a story and more of a manifesto, but it's a really interesting glimpse into the way that the early medieval English read Greek and Roman mythology. They didn't think it was made up, they mostly believed that all of it happened, but they thought that the gods were either demons or sorcerers or just people walking around demanding to be called gods. As you may know, many very obviously mortal Roman emperors called themselves gods, and it makes sense that the monks and scholars of early medieval Europe would assume that just as those men were masquerading as gods, so too was Apollo and Zeus, here called Job, and Saturn. My guess is that the only reason the poet threw Saturn in at the end is because that's a name that everyone would know. Even in those years, the last day of the week was called Saturnus Day. We then get a brief description of Circe.
Sjolde ak wees an Apollinus dochter dier boren Odysseus volkes, gumrinche giden, ku de jaldra fella, drie van drie kraftas. Heu je dwollan filde monna sweedost monigra theoda, kuningus dochter, seu chirice was haten for herium. Heu rik so de ontham ilonde the Aulixes, kuning Thracia, komane to ceole lidan.
So, according to the poet, Circe was crowned as a goddess by her people and knew how to perform Jaldor and Druikraft. These are difficult terms to define specifically, but they both meant something like magic. The words themselves aren't inherently negative, but they do often get used to describe anti-Christian sorcery, typically performed with the help of some sort of demon, and usually amounting to pure illusion. For example, when Ælfred narrates the passion of Saints Peter and Paul, the wizard Simon uses Druikraft to make a dead body appear alive, to make magical dogs appear out of nowhere, and even to fly. But when Peter and Paul expose the illusion, the spells fail every time. That is the category into which the poet seems to be lumping Circe, although it's worth mentioning the poet does not deny Circe actually did turn Odysseus's men into animals. Here's the next part.
Kuthwas sona alre thare menie the hire mid wunude adalinges seeth. Heu mid unimete lissum luvede lid monna fran, und he ax was some alle meine evne swas swede he on sevan luvede, that he to his erde anine nyste modus minlan over meith junge, ac he mid tham wive wunude sithan, o that him ne machte monna ani thena sinra thar mid wesan, ac he for tham irdum erdes luste mintun for latan leovne lavord.
So Odysseus and his crew arrive at the island, and the first thing that the poet tells us is not that Circe tricks anyone, but that she falls in love with Odysseus, and that Odysseus loves her back. The language here is pretty strong. We're told that Circe loves Odysseus with unimete lissum, unmeasurable affection, and that he loves her with alle meine, all of his might. As a result, he stays on the island for an extended period of time, apparently losing all desire to return home, which incites his men to abandon him. The idea of Odysseus's men attempting to abandon him on Circe's island seems to be an invention of the Old English poet, but maybe he's confusing it with some other story or referencing a tradition that I'm forgetting. If you have an idea of where this comes from, be sure to let me know in the comments. The next section is my favorite, as we get a vivid description of the transformations.
Tha on gunnon wirchan wertheud a spell, seidon that heu sholde mid hire sheen lake bernas for bredan, ont mid balukraftum radum werpan on wildra liege kuninges thenas, kisban sithan ont mid rakantan ak rapan menine. Sume hi to wolven wordun, ne machton thonne word forth bringan, ac hi thrach me alum theutan on gunnon. Sume warun evras, a grimetidun thonne hi saras wat selvian sholdun. Tha the leon warun on gunnon lavliche irringa ryn a thonne hi sholdun clipian for corthre. Knichtas wordun alde je junge alle for huerfde to sumum deore, swelcome he error on his liefdagum je likos was, buton tham kuninge, the seo quain luvode. Nolde thara oldra anion bitan mennisches metes, ac hi ma luvodon deora drochdath, swa hiti devene was. Nabdon hi mare monnum je liches erthbuendum thonne injethonk, have de andra je welch his agen mod, that was thach swede sorgum je bunden, for tham arvothum, the him on Saturn.
Now, as you may know, in the actual Odyssey, Odysseus's men are all turned into swine, but there are other animals there, as mentioned in the Aeneid, when Aeneas sails past her island and hears lions, boars, wolves, etc. Boethius's original Latin mentions these other animals, and the Old English translator seems to have come away from this with the impression that Circe turned Odysseus's men into said lions, boars, and wolves. Fascinatingly, he also extends this idea of vice making a person more animalistic into the notion that Circe transformed each of Odysseus's men into the animal that that person resembled the most internally, like something out of Harry Potter. It's a really clever extension of the original idea Boethius was developing. That is the end of what the poem has to say about the Odyssey, as the rest is purely philosophical. For the sake of finishing our reading of the poem, I will read the last couple lines to end the video today, but I hope you enjoyed this glimpse into Odysseus's legacy in early medieval England. The average member of the educated elite probably knew who he was. They could tell you a few details about the Trojan War and how Odysseus got home, but beyond that, he just wasn't a very important figure to them, and this is his only mention in the entire vernacular literature. It wouldn't be until later in the Middle Ages that knowledge of Greek returns to Britain, and the Odyssey becomes the staple that it is today. Do let me know what you thought of all this, especially if you noticed some connection to the classical mythology that I missed. If you like content like this, be sure to check out the rest of the channel. I'd also quickly ask you to kindly consider subscribing or becoming a supporter on Patreon, which allows me to spend the necessary time on these videos. And now, without further delay, let's read the rest of the poem.
Hvar það dysgan men bei thissum drygkraftum longe livdon, lasum spellum. Wisdom whether that ye witne mij mod on wendan monne ani mid drygkraftum, thach heu je don machte that tha leech om on longe thrage on wenwoorden. Is that wunderlich Minecraft Mitchell mod je welches over leech om on lanne on sanne. Swelcome on swelcome thu macht swetele on yitan, that das leech om on listas on craftas of tham mode kumath monna je welcome, an libra alch. Thu macht ade on yitan, that te maderath monna je welcome modus untha thon ne medtrumnes lanes leech om on. Natharf leuda non wane on thare weirde, that werie flash that mod maya monna anius allengato him avre on wendan, ac tha unthawas alchus modus, on that inithonk alchus monnes, thon a leech homon leet thider hit wille.
Thanks so much for watching, and Farath ye Yesunde.